Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member for Yorkton Melville. Millions of Canadians, Madam Speaker, live with a mental illness. Tragically, each year, more than 4,000 Canadians commit suicide, the vast majority of whom suffer from a mental illness. And concerningly, Madam Speaker, many more Canadians who suffer from mental illness will have their lives prematurely ended as a result of this Liberal government's ideologically driven, evidence-free expansion of MAiD in cases where mental illness is the sole underlying condition. It was not long ago that the Minister of Justice himself cautioned against expanding MAiD in cases where mental illness is the sole underlying condition. In this very place, when Bill C-7 was debated, he said that there are, quote, inherent complexities and risks with MAiD on the basis of mental illness as the sole criterion, such as suicidality being a symptom of some mental illnesses, end of quote. What has changed? Those inherent complexities and risks remain. What has changed is purely political. When Bill C-7 went over to the Senate adopted a significant amendment to drastically expand MAiD in cases of sole mental illness by way of a sunset clause that would come into effect in March of 2023. Despite having spoke of inherent complexities and risks, the Minister of Justice incredibly did a 180-degree turnaround and accepted the Senate amendment despite the absence of meaningful study and the absence of meaningful consultation. And then this Liberal government shut down debate to ram through the bill, to ram through this radical expansion of MAiD. By law, in order to qualify for MAiD, it must be established that the patient suffers from a grievous and irremediable condition that is incurable, in which one is in an irreversible state of decline. In other words, in order to qualify for MAiD, it must be established that one cannot get better. The Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, of which I'm a vice chair, has heard testimony from medical experts, including psychiatrists, and the evidence is that it is not safe to move ahead. And that is because it is not possible, or at the very least difficult, to predict irremediability. Even the government's own expert panel concluded as much. On page 9 of the government's own expert panel report, the expert panel said, quote, "It is difficult, if not impossible, for clinicians to make accurate predictions about the future for an individual patient," end of quote, in cases of sole mental illness. And so what that means is that persons who are suffering from mental illness, who could get better, who could go on to lead happy and productive lives, will have their lives prematurely ended. And so I submit that it is reckless, it is irresponsible for this government to move ahead. What this government should do instead is take the evidence of the expert panel, listen to the experts who've come before the Special Joint Committee, and put a pause on this significant and, I would submit, dangerous expansion of MAiD. Anything less is a betrayal of some of the most vulnerable people in this country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I submit to my honourable colleague that he has spent quite a lot of time in rooms with experts discussing this issue, far, far more than I have. I'm new to this conversation. It's uncomfortable, it's intimidating, it's scary. And we're not experts on mental health in this room, but my honourable colleague has heard from many. And I wonder if he could articulate to this chamber this evening what he's heard on the other side of the argument. Because I do understand that there is a valid case from medical experts, psychologists, psychiatrists, that it is discriminatory to withhold medical assistance in dying from people whose sole underlying affliction is mental health. For the purpose of a thorough debate, I wonder, given his expertise, if he could provide the House with some insight on what he disagrees with some of these experts on. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Madam Speaker, I thank the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health, and he is right. There are those who would make the argument that he just made on the basis of Section 15, or that he asserts that some who have come before the committee have made. That's fair, but the issue is, can this be done safely? And the balance of evidence before the committee is that it cannot, at least at this time. And so what the government should do, and what they should have done all along, is undertaken the appropriate review instead of rushing ahead and saying, we're doing this, and now we're going to study it. In short, I would submit the government put the cart before the horse, and unfortunately, vulnerable people are going to be put at risk. But there is an opportunity still, because it's not March of 2023 yet, for the government to extend the sunset.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Montcalm.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I find my colleague quite bold, because in the Conservatives are the ones who stated from the outset that they couldn't go farther with the time frame, that the date set out initially was problematic. They accepted a date in June, and now it's February, and today they're saying that we have to take the time to look at it. But during all of that time, they resisted or prevented us from planning the work. I heard from the same experts. I read the same reports from the experts, and even if initially I wasn't convinced about accessibility when a mental illness is the only health condition referred to, that's not what the experts say in that report. We're going to work on the issues, and instead of taking a very ideological position, the government, they're saying, is ideological. It speaks for itself. But my colleague is also making a very ideological statement, because he's quoting from only one part of the report. When we look at the report as a whole, the conditions mentioned for someone with mental illness and conditions for having access, it represent a very small percentage of people, and it's not. It doesn't cover people contemplating suicide.
Speaker, I don't quite, with respect to the member for Montcalm, who's made many important contributions to that committee, I have to say I'm confused as to what he's saying, that we are somehow delaying this. The committee agreed that we needed more time to study the many complex issues, and now what we have is a sunset clause that will expire at the same time that we're tabling a report. I mean, that is incredible when we're talking about an issue like life and death, and it underscores the need for why the government needs to extend the sunset clause so that we protect vulnerable people, so that we can ensure that we get this right, and so that we can ensure that people do not fall through the cracks, because after all, we're talking about life and death.
Honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby, a very short question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We would all agree in this House that we are in a mental health crisis. We would all agree that there have been no federal government resources applied to provide supports for Canadians who are suffering from this mental health and addiction crisis, dozens of whom are dying every day. So I would ask my colleague from the Conservative Party, would he agree, as a representative of the Conservative Party, to having this House move unanimously to direct the government to provide that $4.5 billion in support for the Canadian mental health transfer immediately?
The honourable member for St Albert Edmonton, 10 seconds.
I would concur with the member for New Westminster Burnaby that there has been a lack, there's inadequate federal funding. Only about 10% of all health care funding relates to mental health. And so what is important is the government work to step that up and work collaboratively with the provinces to ensure that gaps are closed.